Good afternoon. I'm Jim Townsend, and I am director of the Carl Levin Center for Oversight and Democracy at Wayne State University Law School. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's panel discussion entitled Pursuing Factual Consensus, the Role of the Media. Thank you for joining us. Today's panel is the third of a series of online discussions the Levin Center is holding this year to explore how facts become established in the public mind and the role various institutions, including legislatures and the media, play in uncovering facts and influencing the public to embrace them as true. In our previous panels on pursuing factual consensus, we explored the larger ecosystem of oversight and public accountability. That's this web of institutions, including government, universities, the professions, civic and religious organizations, the media, and of course the public, that ultimately decides what we hold as true, what we think we know. In our first panel, we heard from scholars of politics and public opinion about how our politics have gotten so polarized and how many of us have become, let's face it, contemptuous of fellow citizens who hold different political views. In our second panel, we heard from three distinguished United States senators about the responsibility that public officials, especially lawmakers, have to the norms of truthfulness and to working across the political divide to find facts. So today we're going to hear from an outstanding panel of media scholars and journalists about the evolution of the media. How has the media landscape changed, both locally and nationally? And how have those changes affected the information consumption habits of Americans? How is this affecting our ability as a people to reach consensus on important facts? And what, if anything, can we do to lure Americans out of their partisan information silos and engage with facts and each other across the political divide? So that's what we're hoping to talk about today. I'm now going to introduce our moderator, Professor Josh McCrane. Josh serves as assistant professor of political science at the University of Utah. He is also a Levin Center Oversight Fellow this year. Josh holds a PhD in political science from Emory University and an MA and BA from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Go Tar Heels. Josh's current projects involve analyzing local media in the United States, revolving door lobbying, and health policy. I will come back at the end of the panel just to wrap things up, but before I go, I want to acknowledge the excellent work of the Levin Center's Margot Lapere, who took the lead in organizing today's event. Now, Josh, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Jim, for the introduction, and also thanks again for Margot for all of her work behind the scenes. We really appreciate it. I appreciate being here. This is an excellent panel about something that's obviously very timely. It's really nice to talk about this right before the election. And in particular, a lot of what we will talk about today has a lot of salience to a lot of the elections going on across the country, and then again for the next presidential election. So I'm going to briefly introduce our incredible panelists, and then we're going to jump in right into the questions. Our first panelist in alphabetical order is Danny Hayes. So Danny Hayes is a professor of political science at George Washington University. He got his PhD from the University of Texas in Austin, where he also earned a master's degree in journalism. He's a former journalist. Danny Hayes' research has focused on the media, public opinion, and elections. He's authored 3 books, all published by Cambridge University Press, including the most recent one, News Hole: The Demise of Local Journalism and Political Engagement, which is a very timely topic for today. His work has been supported by the National Science Foundation, has appeared in a bunch of the top outlets in our discipline, including the American Journal of Political Science and the Journal of Politics. He's also served as an editor and contributor to the Monkey Cage, which is a really amazing resource of political science engaging with the public on the Washington Post. He was the recipient of the 2018 Kinney Prize for Innovation in Teaching for introductory courses, and has three times been named George Washington University's best professor by the student newspaper, The Hatchet. So Danny, we're really happy to have you here. So next we have Claudia. Claudia is a congressional correspondent assigned to NPR's Washington desk. Before joining NPR in 2019, she was a Capitol Hill reporter covering military affairs for Stars and Stripes. She's covered breaking news involving fallen service members and the Trump administration's relationship with the military. She's also investigated service members who have undergone toxic exposures, such as the atomic veterans who participated in nuclear bomb testing and subsequent cleanup operations. Prior to Stars and Stripes, she was an award-winning reporter for the daily newspaper in Central Texas, the Austin American-Statesman, for 16 years. She's conducted a years-long probe into uncovering systemic abuses and corruption at the Pedernales Electric Cooperative, the largest member-owned utility in the country. This investigation led to the ousting of more than a dozen executives, state and U.S. congressional hearings, and criminal convictions for 2 of the co-op's leaders. She's originally from Chicago and is an alum of the University of Houston, the University of Texas, and Syracuse. At Syracuse, she attended the SI Newhouse School of Public Communications, where she earned a master's degree in journalism. So thank you so much for joining us, Claudia. Next, we have Jiquanda. So Jiquanda is an award-winning journalist with nearly 20 years of experience in journalism. She is the founder and CEO of Brown Impact Media Group, an independent publishing company focused on developing media products in underserved and marginalized communities. The company kicked off efforts in 2017 with flintbeat.com, covering the city of Flint, and in 2020, she launched Black Like Us in partnership with Facebook, which takes a close look at Black America by showing the diversity within the community through thought-provoking commentary and stories from a variety of Black perspectives. So we have this is an incredible panel, as you just heard in these introductions. So I'm going to just start handing it off to them now, and we're going to jump right into the conversation with some questions. So I'm going to start with a really easy one, which is how do we think, and how do you think that media news consumption shape our understanding of facts at a societal level? So definitely a very easy, specific question here. And so I'll just start it off by just going again in alphabetical order, and then we can just kind of just see where it goes organically. So Danny, do you have any initial opening thoughts on the media's role and how the U.S. populace understands what quote unquote facts are?
Well, thanks, Josh, very, very much for the introduction, and to Jim and to Margot and everybody for inviting me to be on the panel. It's great to be here with Jiquanda and Claudia. I think it's it goes without saying, I think, that the media plays a fundamental role in the way that people understand society and politics. The way that people understand facts, of course, is probably a little more complicated because it depends on how people want to think about what facts are. But there's obviously a strong relationship between what people see in the news and how they understand the political world. That's been true since the invention of media and communication, and it's still true today. But obviously the biggest change that, to the media landscape in the last, few decades has been the fragmentation of the media environment, such that we no longer live in a world where most Americans get most of their news from more or less the same places. Even as recently as the early 1980s, for example, the vast majority of Americans' news consumption was pretty homogenous. That is, most people got their news from a handful of large national news outlets like the broadcast networks or national papers, or more likely their local newspapers, which in many ways had a monopoly over people's news consumption. And so that meant that there was a pretty shared understanding of what was happening in the world, because most people weren't getting disparate sources or disparate information. Obviously now, with a fragmented media environment, not only with cable television, but with social media, meaning that people can get news that, if they want, tells them what they want to hear. And that has obviously had a lot of profound consequences for our ability, not only politically, but I think societally, to come together and understand not only what the solutions to important problems are, but increasingly what the most important problems facing the country are. And so the changes to the media environment, I think, has a profound impact on how that process works.
Thanks, Danny. Let's go next to Claudia.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on this incredible panel. So glad to join all of you here today and for such a compelling and critical and important discussion. I have to agree with a lot of what Danny was saying. He's obviously studied this and seen this. especially from a scholarly viewpoint in terms of studying these trends. I've seen it more on the ground in terms of talking to voters. For example, I've been traveling around the country the last few days, and it's just remarkable, just the different stories I hear as I attend the different campaigns and how the facts are in such opposition to each other as they talk about their different points they're trying to sell to voters. And it's really remarkable too, talking to voters and hearing them repeat a lot of the very same lines that I hear candidates say. And so it just takes me back kind of that moment with Kellyanne Conway talking about alternate facts. And today facts are just what many people see them as, believe them as. It's become a choice what to believe, what not to believe. Even as, for example, I've been covering the January 6th committee hearings and investigation. And for example, in that case, even as maybe evidence is drawn up showing some of the forces, the individuals, the elements, the efforts behind that attack on the Capitol, looking at all that, there are people who still refute it and reject a lot of the findings, even though there's a lot of supporting evidence for it. So we are in a very different age now. And as Danny was mentioning, people will go where they need to go to find the facts that comport with their beliefs. So yes, it's a new day in terms of facts and how they're absorbed by individuals from different media outlets that they choose to follow.
Yeah, really excited to hear more about your campaign coverage here in a little bit. Thanks, Claudia. Jiquanda.
Thank you for having me here also. I'm really glad to be in this space. It definitely is a new day for news. I feel like we are responsible for disseminating information, but sometimes we do not necessarily always help with the understanding of that, right? And now people are definitely getting news from all these different spaces. We have the challenge of trying to stand out as news agencies in spaces like Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, right? And it's hard because they're being bombarded with information. They don't know who a real news agency is versus maybe a blog that someone just decided to do to share their opinions and views. And as a media founder, that's a huge challenge. And then working with these spaces, like for example, Facebook, right? They decided, well, let's verify these news agencies. Let's give people blue checks. Instagram, like let's verify these platforms so people will know that they are getting the right information or they're getting transparent information, factual information. But I think it came a little too late. By that time, we had fake news. And we're combating that and on multiple levels, on local levels, on state levels, national levels, and what that looks like. And so as we take this journey, you know, even I want to see where we grow, how we evolve, you know, as news changes every day and how people get the news. And so that's where I'm keeping my eye at and trying to make sure that I'm able to develop things in those spaces to combat some of the disinformation that people are getting.
So this opens up a lot of really interesting questions. So I think maybe one place to start with is that, so one of the most important roles of the media in the political space is an accountability mechanism on elected officials, right? I mean, this is very clear at the local level, but as well as at the national level, actually covering, as Claudia is doing, for instance, the work of the January 6th committee. But one of the things that I think is really interesting to talk about in the context of accountability is, given that there's this myriad different sources people can turn to for news stories that purely confirm their priors, is there an accountability mechanism that's actually working? Do politicians, especially in highly partisan races, pay attention to what journalists are covering if they think they can just say this is something from the other side? And I don't know if who might have the best idea on how to start this conversation, but if anybody feels like they want to jump in on this one, I think that this is like a really interesting point and gets to the role of the media in representative democracy, and if it's actually functioning the same way as it used to, or if it can function like that again.
I can start us off on there. I'll touch on Jan 6, for example, on that committee. That's been a big question that's been hanging over that panel. Now, initially, right after the attack, there was talk about trying to put together a bipartisan 9/11 style commission. And soon after, we saw top Republicans turn on this idea, both in the House and the Senate. And so Democrats in the House were left with, okay, we got to do our own committee. We got to appoint our own Republicans to this panel. We got to do our own investigation. And so with that, even though they had subpoena power, which was a very powerful tool they've used in terms of accountability, they've been somewhat limited. We've seen Wyoming Republican Liz Cheney, she's the vice chair of the panel, trying to hold individuals accountable. For example, looking at former President Trump, doing everything she can from her perspective of trying to hold someone like him accountable. And in terms of telling a fuller narrative of what happened behind the attack, Trump's role in it, other of his allies, supporters, what have you, they have done that. But when you look at pursuing, for example, a subpoena against the former president, I mean, all they have to do is have a little legal back and forth, and they're done with the conversation with the Jan 6 panel. So that's the accountability there. His former chief of staff, Mark Meadows, for example, he faced a contempt referral. So that was one tool that the panel had. They could issue these criminal contempt referrals. But the Justice Department said, we'll pass. We're not going to prosecute this guy. Now, Steve Bannon was a different case. We did face accountability. So when I look at the Jan 6 example, it's limited. And then I look at my travels recently. For example, I'm going to be reporting on a couple of House districts here surrounding Portland, Oregon, where I am now. One of them to my south is a new congressional district, Oregon 6. And there is a Democrat, Latina woman who is running for the Senate. A lot of Oregon is blue. So in some ways she was expected to pull off a win, but now it's a toss-up. She is running against an election denier. So he has threatened to sue if he loses. So when we think about accountability, you know, I don't know where it goes in some of these cases. Like, how does that resolve if he does indeed lose in this district and people are suing back and forth or whatever, trying to deny the election's results? So it seems limited in some junctures, and in some not, when we see other cases playing out. But in terms of where I've been looking from, it's a tough conversation right now.
Yeah, I agree with Claudia. I think there's little to no accountability, right? And I also see where elected officials, politicians, political wannabes are taking advantage of these platforms in order to send out misinformation, right? I don't know what accountability looks like. If an elected official puts out misinformation, are they cited? You know, even if we write it as news agencies, most of the time, by the time we get the story, it's too late, right? It's already out there. And that's to say, are the people who got the misinformation, are they going to tap into our platforms to get the right information? You know, Flint is the home of the water crisis. And so even in that, there is little, personally to me, there's no accountability there. Flint is still going through a water crisis. No one has really been held accountable for it, even though it was the government who poisoned the city. And so from my point of view, there's nothing out there for us to really hold people accountable when they do things to constituents, when they put out misinformation, and when they abuse their power. And like Claudia, I just want to see if that can ever happen, and what could it possibly look like?
Danny, go ahead.
One thing to add to all of that is that I think it's also true it's important to keep in mind that the media's accountability function has always been limited to some extent. Like people often like to go back to Watergate and say this is sort of the high water mark of mainstream journalism holding an elected official to account. But if you look at the history of Watergate, it wasn't the Washington Post reporting on all the terrible things that Nixon was doing. It was basically the Supreme Court issuing a decision that said that Nixon was going to have to turn over these tapes and it was going to reveal all this bad behavior. And that's the point at which the Republican Party sort of abandons Nixon. So Watergate is an interesting case. It's a certainly a heroic story of journalism, but the journalism itself may not be the thing that actually led to Nixon's downfall. It was the internal politics in the Republican Party. And likewise, I think that one way to think about the media's role in terms of accountability today is that I think the media does still play a pretty significant role in accountability. It's just that the media outlets that politicians are accountable to are no longer necessarily the dominant mainstream news organizations that were the main news sources for Americans 3 decades ago. Fox News on the right, other right-wing news outlets hold Republican politicians quite accountable. And the one reason that election denial is rife throughout the Republican Party, and a majority of the candidates running for office this year on the Republican side refuse to say that Biden is the legitimate president, is because of right-wing media having essentially made that, as a function of Trump's demands, a litmus test for many candidates. So that's an accountability function. It's not a good one. It's not one that serves the public writ large, but it serves a particular political interest. And so the media still has a lot of power there. And the other thing I'd say about this is I think there's also an asymmetric accountability mechanism in American politics today, which is that I think on the left, liberals and Democratic politicians are quite concerned about being embroiled in scandals or having the media report on their failings in government. That's not to say that all Democrats are fearful of the media or go out of their way to be held accountable by news organizations, but it's definitely the case, partly just because of the differences in the political parties. Democrats are much more likely to be worried about that. And so there's an asymmetric accountability mechanism, I think, from the mainstream media that is much more powerful in the Democratic Party than it is in the Republican Party now.
Those are some really great points. Claudia, go ahead.
One extra point. It's interesting what Danny is saying, because I see it play out in Capitol hallways now, and I see it by both parties. Will be in a scrum. This is where reporters gather around a member for an impromptu press conference, if you will, or press discussion with the press. And I'm seeing increasingly members question who is with what outlet, and on both sides, and say, oh, who are you with? Okay, we're done. I'm not doing the scrum right now. Or on the other side, who are you with? I'm out of here. No scrum. It's canceled. So it's playing out in these hallways. And as Danny's pointing to, it's happening around the country, to whereas, maybe they're picking and choosing, they're curating what media outlets they feel like they want to talk to, they feel accountable to and communicate with, and they're blocking out the rest increasingly. And I'm seeing it on both sides, actually.
And it happens also on a local level. Like right now, Flint is in the middle of a mayoral election, and that is exactly what's happening. Like, who are you with? Oh, no, we're not doing that news agency. Or, are you on our side? Are you really going to be fair? Of course, I'm a news agency. What side is Flint beat on, right? And so we're seeing that even play out on a local level, where people know for sure, like, every vote counts, right? There's no electoral college. There's no equation that they have to figure out. Every vote counts, and we're seeing that play out here too.
This is a really fascinating discussion, and is actually giving me a bunch of ideas for some great research projects. So I think this is a really interesting thing here that I'm going to jump in as sort of an outsider to journalism, more just somebody who studies it. Is like, I think that the incentives of the media to cover certain things, right? They have a profit motive, right? So like or not necessarily, and even if it's not a profit motive, there's a money making thing. And this fragmentation of the media has produced this, I guess, mechanism where, you're competing for not just like the general interest eyeballs, you're competing for people who probably already agree with a certain perspective. And I'm curious if you all think that this is changing the the kind of coverage that's being produced sort of in aggregate, and if it's changing the incentives of media outlets at either the national or local level, if that kind of point that I'm making here makes any sense. So for instance, is Fox News going to be critical of Republicans because it's going to make their viewers turn off, right? Is MSNBC going to be critical of Democrats because it's going to make their viewers turn off? My suspicion is there's not a lot of incentive for them to do that.
I think there's not a lot of incentive for them to do that, but also as people who consume news on a regular basis, they know that, right? And I just don't see it changing. Like, they tune into Fox News for a reason.
Mhm.
You know, we read the Washington Post for a reason, the New York Times for a reason, because early on when we were having this conversation, people are choosing news that supports their values, right? Supports their values, their viewpoints, whatever that is, and their interest. And so I don't think that the expectation is there, except from those who have opposite points of view. And so, you know, for a person who doesn't consume Fox, they're going to attack the news, right, that Fox disseminates. But I just think the expectation isn't there.
Yeah, and I guess so. I think maybe what I'm suggesting, and I know Danny has a lot of thoughts on this too, because he's done some research, is that maybe the demand isn't there for down the middle, hard hitting accountability, right? I mean, maybe there's certainly some, but maybe not enough to be competitive in this hyper fragmented market where, as Danny mentioned in the beginning, we can go to whatever outlet we want. And most people who consume media are going to ones that already confirm what their prior beliefs were.
Yeah, I mean, I think the demand question is a huge part of the story, right? So the media economy is an attention economy. That's what news outlets are trying to do. This is what Jiquanda is doing. This is what NPR is doing. You need to have an audience, and that's the way that you sustain yourself. And obviously, one of the big challenges for the kind of mainstream journalism that we're sort of talking about when we talk about accountability, certainly as we've thought about it historically, it's clear that the demand for that kind of coverage is less than what it appeared to be 50 years ago, right? But that was just because most newspapers and major news outlets that were doing that kind of coverage had a monopoly of some sort over attention to the news, but the internet obliterates that. And so now you've got this hyper competitive environment. And so I think one of the things that's shown is that the audience for hard hitting, objective journalism is not gone. It's just smaller than probably what appeared to be the case when, in fact, many people were getting their local newspapers because they wanted the movie listings or the sports scores or the coupons and not so much the coverage of City Hall. And so if you think about, like, Claudia's audience at NPR, if Claudia stopped doing hard-hitting coverage of Congress and serious coverage of the crisis of democracy facing the country and all of the things that NPR audiences care about, they would abandon NPR. They wouldn't want to listen to it anymore because that's exactly why they're there. But one of the things that obviously we've seen in the local media environment is that as local media outlets, monopolies have evaporated, that, like site visits and attention to local news is relatively low enough that many of news outlets can't sustain themselves. And so the question becomes, like, is that because people are just not interested in that kind of journalism in their local communities? And so there isn't an economic model that can support it. Alternatively, and Jiquanda probably has a lot more articulate thoughts about this and obviously a lot more experience thinking about these issues. Another way to think about it is that the kind of news that traditional news organizations, even at the local level, have been producing about local politics or local communities are not necessarily the things that are the most engaging for readers and that readers want. And so maybe another way to think about it is that the demand for the traditional type of news that has dominated the environment at the local level isn't that high, but maybe there's another kind of local news that can provide accountability in local politics and communities that could actually be profitable and help sustain many news organizations for the kind of accountability that democracy needs.
Yeah, I would
So-
just add that it's.
I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. I would just add that, yeah, it's true. Like in terms of holding people accountable, what our audiences expect, for example, at NPR, we would drive away listeners and readers if we took a different tack in some cases. But for example, on the earlier point, I'm trying to cover this district south of Portland, and the Republican candidate is not playing ball. And so sometimes we're forced to get out there and cover stories, and I can't cover it as fully as I would like to. Remarkably, during this recent travel, I've had most Republican candidates want to play ball, but not as often. Now, looking at some of these outlets and in terms of accountability for them, I do think that some do flirt, even Fox News, for example, with accountability. You see when they are covering certain folks, like we could look at the Cheney example for a moment again, and how perhaps you might have expected her to be on Fox one day pre-January 6th committee, but no longer. She's been ousted because she went too far with this committee. And now you see her on outlets like CBS more. And so I find that really interesting. And also I'm really interested in the experimentation happening right now in terms of outlets, startups looking at new experiments, as Danny was mentioning, of keeping it shorter, keeping it tighter, and also trying to be more transparent about reporter biases, that readers, listeners, viewers know there are biases, but wanting to know what those are. I was listening to a podcast the other day, the Kara Swisher podcast with Ben Smith, who helped co-found this Semaphore new media outlet called Semaphore. And that's what he was talking about, is trying to reveal, be a little more transparent about reporter biases. Maybe that's how we can cut it down the middle and keep it short and tight. So it's interesting in terms of the experimentation, where things are going with different outlets right now. I'm really curious to see where all that goes in terms of testing that ground.
I think you'll be surprised about the consumption of news on a really hyper local level. So for Flint Beat, local government is a big deal in the city of Flint, in our audience. On average, with a city of about 80,000 people, we could see 30 to 40,000 unique visitors to our website. We've had community members, so we're the community first. It's the people first in our reporting, and then it goes off elected officials, state level and on. But we are engaged with them and we listen. And so one of the things they asked us before was like, can you just do a roundup of what's going on in city council, because it's so dysfunctional, right? They actually do care where their tax dollars are going. They care where these ARPA funds are going right now, right? And so they're paying attention. And then we had an issue with technology gap. News has become so digital that we're missing a group of people because we're not printing anymore. That's become an issue. We had a group of people that weren't paying attention to news. Millennials, for example, they just weren't engaged at one point in areas like Flint. We're engaging them because we meet them where they are. And so you'll see where we show up with an iPhone there's been mayoral forums. New media outlets have not did them, but some community organizations, we'll pop up and we're going to do a Facebook Live from that forum to make sure we reach our audience in multiple spaces. And so we have to evolve, right? Technology has changed. We have to evolve. I think media outlets have to accept that and come up with these different ways to get the information out there. Because in Flint, at one point, it was water crisis, it was crime and sports. That's all people saw. So when I stepped away from a legacy news organization to launch Flint Beat, I was a little surprised about what they consumed. We can write a crime story. We literally wrote a story about a dead body being found on this major street. We got almost no clicks. But let me do something about ARPA funds. Let me do something about city council, and not the drama. People actually engage with that news. Economic development and business, they just do. And so I'm really surprised about their consumption. And I know that these independent publishers out there are really filling a void. because we're not necessarily focused on clicks, we're focused on impact.
If I could ask Jiquanda a question real quick, if you don't mind. I'm so curious what you're saying about reaching people where they are. Like I think about my kids and I feel like they consume a lot of their news from TikTok. So I'm curious, you said Facebook Live. What are you looking at in terms of delivering news?
So we're crazy on Facebook for some reason. Most of our people come from Facebook and they start following our website. I'm the oldest person in my newsroom. I'm 46. And so I think the youngest person is 24 and they are thoroughly engaged. Like right now, they're getting ready to take over social. One of them is taking over Twitter. Another one is trying to develop what does it look like on TikTok. And we're experimenting with video. And it's mostly with restorative narrative. How do we amplify these voices in the city of Flint, including people who at one point they didn't engage with news. And sometimes we do stuff. We started following music artists around, right? Once we wrote a couple stories about the work that they were doing, they're following our platforms. So they're consuming other news and we see them sharing it and reading it. And so you just have to think outside of the box. The consumer is changing. And we have to be prepared as media agencies to engage with the new consumer that needs the information in order to make better decisions, have a better quality of life. Like it was inevitable. And so we have to get out of our antiquated way of thinking. And so I just engage my team and they are extremely bright. You know, I don't know everything and I understand that.
Yeah, this is a really interesting discussion because, you know, I've done a lot of research on local media in particular, is the economic facts about local media are extremely grim. In the legacy TV space for local broadcasts, we know for a fact, right, that through companies such as Sinclair, they're cutting across the board local reporting. They're doing a lot less local reporting. They're doing a lot more reporting on national politics. We know in the Sinclair case that reporting is also very similar to Fox News from a very kind of right-wing propaganda perspective. This is not so much the fault of the outlets as it is the ownership group, right? And this is a trend that's happening more broadly across the country, not just a Sinclair thing. This is, of course, probably and is in fact even worse among newspapers. Newspapers are being bought up by venture capital and major conglomerates. They're being gutted. They're losing journalists. But you know, I think the point of this discussion that's interesting is that this is all in the context of some sense of what consumers want, right? The reason these things are happening is consumers are just frankly not willing to pay, certainly not pay enough for to sustain these outlets in any meaningful way. And so Jiquanda's model is interesting, and it would be really interesting to think through how that translates to elsewhere in the country. But it does still imply that there is some sort of financial support that's available, and it can't just be from a nonprofit perspective, because a nonprofit means they still need to be able to make some money somehow. And I'm curious what we think about this, right? I mean, and this has a lot to do with what we've already talked about with what consumers want out of their media, the fragmentation that's available, and this idea where you can consume purely partisan media. So is there even any room to compete on this space of purely local journalism, at least at a large kind of scalable way?
Okay. We have a question too about how Flint Beat is supported. It's hard. And so I think there's a number of us that are working to, like, what does this look like? What does sustainability look like for these independent newsrooms, right? And so with Flint Beat, we have a diverse revenue model. Currently, most of our funding comes through grants. Then it's donations. And then we have people we call sustaining members. And then lastly, advertising. Like, advertising is the hardest thing for me. And so we haven't quite developed that out. But we are a for-profit newsroom. We are not nonprofit. But since our model fits with nonprofit news work, we've managed to really tap into grant funds from like the Borealis Racial Equity and Journalism Fund. We've been supported from the Solutions Journalism Network. is Facebook. Facebook for a second there, they were giving monies to newsrooms for like COVID coverage and things of that nature. And also to help us develop some type of sustainability and getting coaching. And so this model, we don't know. We absolutely do not know, because things have shifted. And like you said, I can't get people to value news enough where they are consistent with being a member or paying $5 a month. I mean, seriously, $5 a month. But I think that that's something that was set prior to these startups. Legacy newsrooms are trying to figure out, how do we charge for content on our websites, right? And so when the New York Times did it well, they jumped in and they did it, and they were like, you're gonna have to pay. But these other newsrooms just did not. And so people expect to consume information for free. They don't quite understand what goes on behind the scenes and operating as we try to pay reporters. My newsroom we have 4 full-time team members, and we only cover the city of Flint. And so people crack jokes and they say, well, you have more reporters covering specifically Flint than other news agencies who are bringing in a ton of money in comparison. I think last year, with grant support, donations, our annual fundraiser, we did bring in the tune of about $400,000. Some of that money was earmarked for certain projects, but we're managing to do it. It just has not been easy. I have not met one founder of one of these smaller news agencies that said, I had it all figured out. This was easy, and the money just started flooding in. We're just finding that there are foundations and organizations that value news and are willing to invest. And we are trying to leverage that while we can, right? And so that's the story.
Yeah, and I think like you're really doing a great job of highlighting the challenge here, which is this is so idiosyncratic that it's not really a model, right? It's so localized, but this is a huge problem. I mean, this I think, and if we can turn it to this discussion or not, but this to me is like, actually, I'm extremely pessimistic about the future of local news because of exactly what you're describing. And I can't really envision a way in which we have anything sustainable, at least as a model that works, unless we get into a perspective of thinking about this as a public good rather than something that's like a product. I don't know if anybody else has any thoughts on that, if they want to jump in, but that's sort of my prior on this.
Well, the most optimistic way to think, one of the more optimistic ways to think about this is that for one, the success of news and media historically in the United States has always been a reflection of subsidies of some type. Like newspapers ultimately, originally benefited from Postal Service subsidy, the Postal Service being created to deliver newspapers and other publications. The government has subsidized the broadcast networks for decades by basically allowing them to lease the space on the digital spectrum for much less than they would have to pay for it if it was auctioned off entirely on the private market. And then the monopolies, of course, that existed in the middle of the 20th century that allowed local news outlets to develop hold these big and maintain these big audiences. So one way to think about it is that, the possibility of subsidies, either coming from the government or other philanthropic organizations that can help local news organizations survive, does seem, as Josh has pointed out, I think rightly, a rickety foundation on which to build something that's so important to local government and democracy. But at the same time, it may not be that far afield from the history of news production and the sustaining of the industry throughout American history. The other thing is, and I think both what Jiquanda was saying and what Josh, what you were getting at, is that I think you're right. There's not going to be a single model that looks like the Austin American-Statesman, is going to look like the Dallas Morning News, is going to look like the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, is going to look like any other paper across the country. But what you're going to have is, in different communities, entrepreneurial people like Jiquanda and others figuring out in their community what works as a revenue model. So as another example of this, in the DC area, in Arlington, Virginia, there's a news outlet called Arlington Now. Arlington Now was started in 2010 by a guy who got his undergrad from GW and got a master's degree from Georgetown, and saw an opening for local news covering Arlington County. Arlington County is one of the wealthiest counties in the country. It's very educated. It's mostly lawyers who work in DC, basically, as far as I can tell. And so it's a very different community than many other communities across the country. But he's managed to build a news site that is profitable and has a large enough audience to generate revenue, I think solely, or not solely, but maybe a vast majority of it with advertising revenue. Now, that's only going to work in some communities, but it's just an illustration of the kinds of things that other local news entrepreneurs in other communities, that model is not going to work, but it is going to work in certain types of places. So I think that, as Josh was pointing out, it's not a model. It doesn't scale, but this is like why you have to have the experimentation for people in different communities to figure out what works there. And I'm a little more optimistic, Josh knows this, than Josh is about the demand for local news. And I might be wrong. I've shed a tear. But I think I am heartened by all of the energy that people who care about this and know how important it is, are the energy that they're putting into it. And we're still, I think, very early in the period of experimentation. And so I'm optimistic that some solution will ultimately be arrived at. That's obviously not going to look like it was 50 years ago, but that can do the work that we need.
Yeah, I would just add that I guess I'm optimistic and pessimistic at the same time, just coming from, where Danny was before as well in Austin, Texas, and seeing, for example, in my case, when I was at the Statesman and just seeing the deterioration of the resources play out right before my eyes and escaping before the Gannett purchase and that trimmed down staff even more. It's just the newspaper's unrecognizable to my time there. At the same time, when I was in Austin, seeing new outlets, nonprofit efforts come up like the Texas Tribune and the success they've seen. And then recently I noticed one of our NPR stations in the Dallas area bought a newspaper. And so, yeah, I think it is, maybe the answer is local. Maybe that is what, in terms of the connection with the media, the new connection that the media can find with local listeners, readers, viewers, what have you. And so it's still, I think, a tough moment in some ways, but in other ways, we see all of these new efforts in media, like what Jiquanda's doing in Flint, and what we're seeing, for example, we're seeing a lot of new newsletters, for example, launch in DC. It's like the newsletter and the Substack is the new blog, if you will, in terms of trying to reach people with news. So it'll be interesting to see what comes, but I'm just not sure if I'm more optimistic or more pessimistic about it in the end.
And I would point out one interesting feature of this that we do know from a lot of the social science research is that consumers do not actually want, and they'll state this in a variety of ways, they want more stuff on national politics and less on local politics, which is another dynamic here that's sort of pernicious. Jiquanda, sorry, I think you were going to say something if you wanted to jump in.
No, I was jumping off Claudia, her comment, because we talked about resources and independent news agencies. We collaborate and partner now. There used to be a time where we're so competitive in the industry, it prevented us from partnering just to get news out. And so Flint Beat has partnered with the New York Times. We've worked with the trace.org. We worked for Center for Public Integrity. We worked with Michigan State universities to get news out about COVID. We've worked with Stanford to get information out about COVID. And we also share content. And so I can publish a story that on the water crisis, it could get published in Great Lakes Now. Bridge, for example, we're all in partnership where we can co-publish or we can publish Bridges information. We've worked with Frontline PBS. And so we understand that our capacity is limited, our resources are limited, But we're a newsroom, and many others are like this, that want to inform the public. We want to have impact. We want them to have information. And so we're partnering to make that happen on a bigger scale.
I think it might be a good time to turn over to some of the audience questions, because those are going to generate some more conversation. In particular, there's a few really good ones. So just real quick, so Julia Azari has just a good, interesting kind of factual question about, it's sort of like, is like legacy news still widely consumed? And the answer is very much yes. But it is exactly the way you would think. It's like the 60 and older group is basically the only group sustaining most of the existing local journalism financially. Pew has a whole bunch of great stuff on this. And one of the things that I found really interesting in a recent Pew survey on this is that it's a lot of older people who are paying for it, but also it's that most everybody thinks that their local outlet is like financially solvable. It's over like 70% across all age groups think that their financial outlets are very solvable, but in the 30 and under, it's only like 10% of people who are paying for it. So I think that yes, it's very still widely consumed, local TV in particular. But people don't really, I think general public doesn't have a sense of the problem for local news in particular. I don't know, Danny, I know you've done a lot of research on this. I don't know if you have anything to add, but I think it is always shocking to, especially my students, when I tell them how popular local news is still, like broadly, just in terms of numbers.
Yeah, I mean, it's not dead. Though I'll say that the only thing I'd add to that is just a colorful anecdote, which is that when Jen Lawless and I were doing interviews as part of our book, we were talking to reporters and newspapers all over the country, and we talked to a reporter who was talking about this particular problem, which is the demographics of loyal local newspaper readers. And he said something to the effect of that, if you're a person who gets up in the morning and eats your Cheerios and reads the newspaper at your kitchen table, you've basically got one foot in the grave. And that's not a sustainable model for a business. And so, it's an exaggeration of the reality, but it does present a particular problem for news outlets, is figuring out how to, as Jiquanda was talking about earlier, engage younger audiences and figure out how generational replacement doesn't lead to the end of local news outlets.
Yeah, I mean, as the token millennial on the panel here, I mean, nobody my age pays for journalism anymore, right? I mean, especially because I get up-to-date stuff on Twitter. If I were to pay for journalism, it'd be the same reason I'm contributing to a charity, right? It'd be that sort of same sense of purpose. And like Jiquanda's saying, there might be something to that, right? Especially around the messaging towards that end, which, I think is like potentially a possible solution, especially in certain parts of the country, like Danny was mentioning in Arlington. So another question that's a little bit changing pace here is that I think is really good in the chat here is this idea that, and you see this a lot on Twitter, that both sides of a story need to be covered, right? And, I think there's a really interesting normative question here and an ethical question, especially those of you who have journalism backgrounds. How do journalists, should they think about that? How do media outlets think about that? And I think this is like obviously very salient given what we've seen through the pandemic, where like there's research that can literally put the number of lives lost to COVID due to Sean Hannity. These are like really important things that are actually affecting health outcomes, if not other things. And I'm wondering what the audience or what the panel here thinks about that sort of topic.
Oh, that's a tough one. I feel like I was just dealing with that. I was reporting in North Carolina, and I had access to both campaigns for a story about the Senate race there, to the Republicans and the Democrats. And I thought it was very necessary to tell the story of both sides. And there are some very sensitive moments in there that I struggled, how am I going to report this piece? But for example, Republicans in North Carolina are using a line there they're using all across the country as a pitch to voters. They're saying Democrats support abortions to the point of birth, I'm sorry. And so, gosh, I was like, oh, I'm gonna have to put this line in my story, but I have to put it in this context of how it's largely misleading. And so I linked to more in-depth reporting. The Washington Post, others have done some really good reporting, flushing out how this is largely a misleading claim. So it's part of this misinformation that you can hear at some of these events for Republicans, for example. And so, yes, this was a both sides moment, but I thought it was a critical moment that everybody should know about what's being said at both of these different campaigns. So I think the argument is not to present both sides without putting it in context. You got to put that line in context and say, that's not quite what Democrats are saying, but you guys are spreading that. And so we got to put that line in there and fact check it. So I think that's why it's critical when I look at both sides, why it's critical to get both sides when possible and put it in context.
Yeah, I agree with Claudia. It is hard, right? When you just know you're interviewing someone and you're just full of it, just to keep it simple. And you do have to put things in context. And so, like right now, for example, there's a campaign out about whether or not our current mayor has decreased crime. He like really bad crime by 40%, right? We have numbers. And so even though he's campaigning on that, we have numbers as to whether or not he's telling the truth. And so we can report he's saying it, but I feel like as a journalist, we are responsible and obligated to make sure that the community knows what those true numbers are, no matter what he's saying. And it's not taking a side, we are telling the truth. You know, we are giving them information and we're charged with that task. But it does definitely make it hard to do your work and trying to find, be objective and make sure we're balanced in a way. So I often find this a challenge when it comes to politics specifically.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. And again, from somebody who's outside of the industry, you know, like for just for example, observing, you know, the national media coverage of the Biden administration versus the Trump administration is we cover Biden administration scandals like we used to cover any scandal. But they're contextualized in that sense, but they're not really contextualized in the sense of like, these are normal scandals. These are not like democracy ruining things that the Trump administration tried to do, you know, every other day. And I think maybe that's some of the frustration, right? It's not so much as like, it's like both perspectives of a given story. It's outside of the broader political context that, you know, I know a lot of people are very frustrated with of the national media is because it's like one of these parties is trying to destroy democracy and the other is not, and maybe we should cover it in that sense, right? And not pretend it's like a normal everyday both sides story. I don't know if you guys want to comment on that or not, but that's sort of my perspective, and I know that's a lot of a perspective of outsiders of the industry.
This is a hard one for me because from a operating standpoint, from a management standpoint, I think people don't see all the moving parts in a news agency, right? And a reporter can have the best interest. A reporter could really, their heart is in it. They want to be factual. They want to be objective. They want things to be balanced. And you'll look up and there's some managerial decision that completely ruins your world as a journalist. I don't think we talk about this often enough. So your headline will get changed and it's clickbait and you know it's sensationalized, but you didn't make that decision as the reporter. That was made up top because they need those clicks, they need that audience, they need to sell ads because they're trying to survive. Now, I do think that a lot of newsrooms are top heavy, very, very, very top heavy with salaries, right? And the little man that's out there doing the news is making nothing, which is pretty much the American way. And so I just, as a journalist and having my heart broken as a writer, doing a story where management comes in and they just completely shift things because they need to get those clicks. I think that we need to talk about that more. We need to share that more, because we are doing ourselves a disservice as writers and truth seekers and those people who we want to get out the right information. So if no one knows behind the scenes, there's so many moving parts in this, because news is looked at as a business. And so like when we launched, even though I know that it's a business, I know we need to sustain. One of the things my reporters do not have to do is worry about clicks. Like they just absolutely don't. And when I sell advertising, I'm selling my audience and not necessarily the numbers. If you have a product or a service and you're trying to reach Flint, we have Flint. I'm not going to promise you all of these amazing clicks in order to make it happen. And I'm not doing moves in my newsroom so that you can get what you need to get as an advertiser. Either you want this audience or you don't. That's probably why I have a hard time selling advertising. So there's so much going on that is heartbreaking. From a business point, I understand. From a journalist standpoint, I hate it.
Yeah, I always think about the Ronan Farrow example as he tried to report out Harvey Weinstein. And how many times did that guy get rejected with this incredible story that kind of helped spark the Me Too movement? I mean, what if he wouldn't have kept pushing with that? So it's stories like that that can get lost, in terms of greater business interests in some cases.
Yeah, I mean, I guess something that we definitely don't think about enough is both the incentives of the individual journalist, but mostly of how those are shaped, I think, by the profit motive or the money, even if it's not profit motive, but the money potential of a story. And this is sort of what I was trying to get at the beginning, right? Is that in an era where people want partisan media, like what is the motivation of a media producing company to do something down the middle? When we know that is not the best way to generate money. And what does that mean? Like sort of aggregate it up for accountability, right? And I think that's a really important topic.
My motivation is that, as a person in this space, I just want to see a more equitable community. And so I am in the business to empower, impact, and inform, in hopes that this community will make the best decision for themselves to improve their quality of life, for elected officials or change makers and policymakers to be able to make better decisions. Like my news is heavily invested in like solutions journalism and writing things to help fix this space, fix Flint, right? And so that's my motivation. Will my motivation help sustain the work? I don't know. We'll see. If it doesn't, I'll write a big write-up in an article and let the whole world know what this looks like and why this journey has come to an end. I'm in it to win. I hope that we become a legacy newsroom based on these values that we have now today. And we'll see what happens, but I am motivated just because I want the world to be a better place. I want elected officials to be held accountable. I want our tax dollars to do what they're supposed to do. I want elected officials to know that they work for the people. The people don't work for you. And so I'm in it for that. Maybe I'm naive. I don't know. Maybe it's a dream. I have no idea, but we'll see. Like I'm here as long as I can be to see what this looks like in hopes that it takes off and others can do what I'm doing.
I also think it's important not to exaggerate the market for partisan news. I mean, it's certainly true that it exists, and there are some people for whom that's the best part of their day when they get to read headlines owning the other side or whatever. But there's a significant swath of the country that doesn't care that much about partisan news, and partly because if you want to consume partisan news, you got to curate your feeds, and you have to in some cases seek it out. And there's enough people that aren't interested enough in politics and political news to do that. that's why you see that like the most popular sites online are places like Yahoo or, you know, like in a previous era, AOL, which are just basically not partisan news sources. They're not the kinds of news sources that academics would think people should be, are necessarily going to get the best information, but it's basically just headlines, basic stuff that if we think about citizens just needing to kind of know what's going on, it's probably enough. So, and if you look at like Marcus Pryor, professor at Princeton, he's got Nielsen data about 10 years ago, looked at the percentage of American households that had Fox or MSNBC on at least 6 minutes a day. And it was less than 20%. Now, that's 10 years ago, and so that number is surely higher now, but it's not going to be reversed. It's not 80% now. So it just tells you that partisan news is loud and it occupies a lot of our space, but it's not necessarily because it's the thing that the public at large is gravitating toward. It plays an outsized role in our politics because it's about elite conversations, and elites care a lot about what partisan news outlets are saying. But I don't think that is necessarily the same thing as consumers not being interested in news that doesn't advocate for their side. Again, I might turn out to be wrong in 15 years, and that's all we have. But I think that there's enough evidence in consumption patterns to suggest that there's a pretty significant market out there that doesn't necessarily want news that is only advocating for their side.
Well, I mean, but isn't that a little bit contrary to the historical perspective of the success of newspapers? A lot of newspapers were partisan newspapers as well, right?
Partisan on their editorial pages, but even the newspapers historically that were partisan in their editorial pages throughout most of the 20th century, their news reporting was not necessarily designed to sort of advocate for their own politicians. I mean, the most profitable period for newspapers in the United States was in the middle of the 20th century. And that's a period in which most newspapers were, they endorsed and they had a partisan affiliation, but their news reporting was not designed to bring down a government if it was run by members of the other party.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a case where you have a bundled content, and part of that content is partisan, and the identity of a paper might be partisan, but that doesn't mean that everybody that's reading the newspaper is reading it because they want that partisan content. There's a lot of other stuff. And so, no, again, it's also not evidence that what people cared about was the city hall coverage. It may have been all the other stuff that was in the paper, but I don't think that's necessarily evidence that partisan news itself is super popular. Because you can just look at the most popular news outlets in the United States today, and they're not, by and large, if you aggregate them all, they're not by and large what we would think of as partisan news. Now, some of them may have taken on, like come to in the public mind, be seen as partisan. Now, Claudia is going to bristle every time somebody says that NPR is a liberal news outlet. And I don't think that, and like, you know, there's ways of measuring this, et cetera. But the way that the reason that people think that is partly because people think it's a liberal news outlet. But if you look at the content of NPR, right, there's a better case to be made that it's basically just trying to cover the government as it exists. So I think that like part of this is just about the way that people think about what partisan news is. And the other part is I think that there's a bigger demand for nonpartisan news than might appear to exist.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, Danny, we talk about this all day. I mean, I would push back and say that, you know, what we do know is that media outlets in, you know, partisan areas, their content looks more like the partisanship of those areas, right? That's the classic against Cal Shapiro sort of finding. But anyway, so let's stop here and just real fast, if anybody has any closing comments before Jim comes on, I'll open it back up. But I really appreciate you all. This has been really fun. So if anybody else has anything else they'd like to say, please go ahead and jump in. Otherwise, we'll leave it open for Jim.
I just wanted to say thank you so much for moderating, Josh. And this was such an incredible panel. Everybody's so inspiring and such an incredible discussion to have today. And so critical and compelling in terms of what we need to be thinking about today in terms of media and connecting with folks out there.
I appreciate you pushing back on my cynicism collectively. All right, I think then we're done then, Jim. If you want to go ahead and come back, and I really appreciate everybody. This has been a great topic, and thanks so much for the Levin Center for hosting it.
Well, Thank you for what an amazing conversation. First, let me thank you, Josh, for doing such a great job moderating this panel, and thank Jiquanda, Danny, and Claudia for participating. I just learned an incredible amount, and I will say I feel I'm glad people push back a little bit on Josh's pessimism, although I think a lot of us share a similar set of concerns or a broader sense that our media environment, our media system is not serving the public interest the way I think we would all, probably not all, but many of us would agree it used to. So in the just couple of minutes, let's see. It's very hard to sum up all the great ideas and interesting perspectives that we have that we just heard, but I thought it was really interesting. Just the opening set of conversations around the fact that, well, the reality that facts have become really a choice in this environment where people can opt into as I said before, a very siloed set of choices, or people are choosing to silo their media consumption in such a way that they can almost choose the facts that they want to focus on, as opposed to just recognize those facts. Now, later in the conversation, just a couple of minutes ago, Danny came forward with some really interesting countervailing data that suggests that the impact of these siloed partisan media environments may be greater, may be exaggerated somewhat, that the statistics suggest that a lot of people are choosing not to participate in those media environments that are so partisan. So the question might be, to what extent can entrepreneurs or innovators at the local and regional level figure out ways to serve people who have an interest in just getting straight news? And Jiquanda obviously is pioneering a very, very interesting approach to assembling the resources and executing local journalism that is focused on solutions and focused on getting people information they need to know to be successful and functioning in their community. In general, the question about accountability and whether the partisan news outlets are really providing accountability, I think the answer was, well, not really, or only in a very limited sense, and that there seems to be a somewhat of a difference between the way Republicans and Democrats operate with respect to that accountability. But at the same time, it does appear that people on both sides of the aisle are doing a degree of reporter shopping, if you will. They're starting to select out or reject talking to certain news outlets that may not be as friendly to them. I really thought the conversation around media deserts was really interesting, and that Jiquanda's points about what was happening in Flint and the success Flint Beat is achieving has to be seen alongside of the reality that, for example, there's no general public forum this year in the mayor's race in Flint, which is an awfully important position. And then finally, I guess, the issues of demand for this kind of news, for middle of the road news, if you will. I thought Danny's perspectives on how important subsidies have always been, that there very often over history have been subsidies from the Postal Service to the spectrum, discounted spectrum access that was provided that really created these monopolies for local news in a bygone era. Maybe that does suggest that there is a possibility for creating some new subsidies that would allow local news to reestablish itself or reinvent itself in a way that's viable. Well, we've now come to the end of this time, and I just want to thank everybody for joining us. Everyone who's in the audience who has come out and watched these panel discussions on pursuing factual consensus. This is the third one. We may do more. We're going to sort of look at this and see if there are additional perspectives we want to tap into. But for anybody who wants to learn more about this, about these panels and about the work of the Levin Center, we really encourage you to come to levin-center.org, and we appreciate the support and want to stay in contact with you. So again, thanks to all of our panelists, and thanks to all of you for joining us. Have a good afternoon.